Hey, do you like my sweater? I do. My wife Libby made it for me many years ago. And one of the cool things about this sweater is I got to meet the sheep who grew the wool. And it's not dyed. This was actually the color of the sheep. So I got to meet these sheep. It was up north in Wisconsin. It was cold, middle of winter. And we go out into this field with the farmer, and he's got these like big mittens, these choppers on, and he just slaps them together and says, "Sheep, sheep, come here, sheep." And over the hill, in a single file line, come these brown sheep, just sort of hesitantly coming, like one would stop, and then the ones behind him would run into him, and he'd go like, "Here, sheep, come on." And they heard his voice, and they'd come, and I got to meet these sheep. It was pretty cool. And I have this great sweater from them. So today's 5-minute devotional, we're going to talk about sheep we'll be talking about sheep for a while. We'll start it today in John chapter 10, verses 1 to 6. "Truly, truly, I say to you," says Jesus, "he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers." This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So if I had gone out into that field and called, "Hey, sheep," and slapped my own mittens together, nothing would have happened. Those sheep knew the voice of their shepherd, of that farmer in northern Wisconsin. And maybe the people that Jesus was talking to didn't know what he was talking about then, but we know what Jesus was talking about. And in fact, there's a long history in the Old Testament of leaders being called shepherds. David, the most famous, most held up king, was himself a shepherd when he was a kid. And in the prophets, leaders are often called shepherds, and they're good shepherds, and they're not as good shepherds. But Jesus, as you guys know if you grew up in Messiah as kids, is the good shepherd, right? So we'll talk more about him being the door next time, but this passage is all about his sheep knowing his voice. And you might remember back in chapter 9 that we just got through, we spent a long time talking about this blind man who Jesus healed, and then there was a big controversy over whether Jesus was leading the people astray or whether he is the Messiah. And there's a conflict of voices, a conflict of religious voices about whether Jesus is who he says he is. And so now we get into a section of Jesus is saying, how do you know what voices to listen to? And here he's saying, if you're his sheep, the ones that are following him, you know his voice. And you know when it's him who's speaking. And you know it's the voice of someone else who's not leading in a good direction, or maybe is like trying to do something bad. Like he talks about thieves and robbers, right? So a question for us is, how do we get to know the voice of Jesus as his sheep? And for the first thing, here's a little clue that we're not alone in this. If you're Jesus' sheep, you have the Holy Spirit in you. And that is most of what you need to be able to know what his voice is and what his voice isn't. But we can also practice. And what we're doing right now is great practice. The more we spend time with what we know are the words of Jesus, what we've got here, the more we know what his voice sounds like, because we've heard it again and again and again. And we know what he says, and we know how he says it. So that we'll be able to discern his voice in different situations. So here's one situation. You're hearing someone talk about and on behalf of God. maybe like I'm doing right now. And if you know Jesus' voice well, you'll know, is this person actually saying things that sound like Jesus, that sound like God, from what I know, from what I have heard. You can actually, I invite you to hold me up to that standard, but anyone else who's talking about God too. But what about also in prayer? Now, we've talked about this at youth group, that prayer isn't just a one-way thing. If you have a feeling in prayer, or even maybe a voice or something that you feel like God might be saying to you, it's helpful to know what Jesus' voice sounds like, because honestly, you want to distinguish, is this God, or is this me, or is this some other voice? The more you get to know Jesus' voice, the easier it is in those situations too. So, we will continue learning about our Good Shepherd, but I encourage you to keep getting to know his voice.